Well, we come to the end of Genesis. We'll be looking at Genesis 49, verse 28, all the way through the end of chapter 50. And primarily, you'll see that this section is divided into three parts. We have the death and burial of Jacob, and at the end, we have the death and burial of Joseph. But in the middle of this, we have this lasting reconciliation. One commentator put it that this reconciliation whereby Joseph speaks about what God has done, that there has been much evil done by man, but God has ultimately been gracious in bringing about his good plan, that's not just the summation of Joseph's life, but it's the summation of the entirety of Genesis. That what man has done and brought great evil, God has been bringing about blessing and good throughout it. So let us pray and come to God's Word. Heavenly Father, now as we come to the end of Genesis, we do pray that you would be with us, guiding us. And as we come to these ancient words, you would be encouraging us and helping us to see that even in death, Jacob and Joseph had hope. And how much greater hope do we have, knowing that there is one who has come who has conquered death. And so now we pray that you indeed would greatly bless us, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So verse 28 of chapter 49. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. That is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the household, and the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only the children and their flocks and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And they went up with him, both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham brought with the field from Ephraim the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph, saying, Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of the land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So we come to, as I said, the end of Genesis. One writer that I was reading in preparation for this, he noted the difference between Hollywood and the Bible. In Hollywood movies, typically the ending is the hero rides off into the sunset. He has accomplished what he meant to do, and he goes off, presumably living a good life. In the Bible, however, we see not a good life, but oftentimes a good death. That he has lived throughout his life. He has seen his generation. He has seen his sons and his sons' sons, and even maybe his sons' sons' sons. And here we have in Jacob and in Joseph good deaths. That they have died richly blessed by the Lord. That doesn't mean their life was free from troubles and trials and tribulations. I mean, indeed, Jacob said earlier that my life has been short and full of evil. And I don't think he was exaggerating. Joseph as well can confess that much of his life, 13 years of his life, was suffering and pain that probably seemed unbearable to him at the time. But yet through it all, the Lord was with them and blessed them. And here we have their deaths spoken of in a way that not only rejoices in what God has done for them, but clearly both men die with faith looking beyond themselves. And so in both ways, we can say that theirs was a good death. They died blessed by the Lord, but they died even more so in faith of what the Lord would eventually do. And I think in many ways, that theme is one that we see in Genesis. If you think about where Genesis is placed, yes, it's the beginning, but really Moses is writing this at a later time when the children of Israel are in slavery. They're suffering. And yet Moses writes and records for them the beginning of the world, the way in which the Lord has been at work. Though sin is in the world and there is suffering and there is evil, yet the Lord is at work. And the Lord is blessing his people, and everything that the Lord has said in Genesis about a future event has all come true. And even in Genesis, he has already told the children of Israel that they would go to Egypt and he would bring them back out. And actually, the book ends with Joseph firmly placing his faith in that promise. Because you'll notice clearly the distinction between what Jacob does and what Joseph does. And you have to stop for a moment and say Joseph had within his power to be carried to Canaan and buried just like Jacob was. But yet he didn't. And I think that's an important point as the book of Genesis ends. And so as we come to the death and burial of Jacob in verse 28 of chapter 49 all the way to verse 14 of chapter 50. It begins with Jacob pronouncing this blessing, or this summary of the blessing that we had seen in the beginning of chapter 49. And it is peculiar because it speaks of Jacob blessing, but actually if you read through these blessings, some of them aren't blessings. One of them is a curse, and some of them seem to indicate a life that is not as glorious as maybe the tribe would have wanted. It speaks of sin and evil and recompense. So how are we to understand that Israel blessed them? Well, you have to think of the difference between Jacob's sons and the sons of Isaac and the sons of Abraham. Because if you think about Abraham, he had 2 sons, but only one inherited the blessing. And you think of Isaac, he had 2 sons, and only one inherited the blessing of his father. But when you come to Jacob, he has 12 sons, and actually all of them inherit the blessing. All of them are sons of the covenant. And all of them continue and carry on that covenantal blessing, despite the ways in which their own sin has come upon them and to some degree to their later generation. Nonetheless, they are covenantally blessed. And it's that tension you see throughout the Bible, that you are responsible for your own sins, and unfortunately our own sins can also spill over into those around us. But at the same time, those who are in the covenant are blessed by God. And we see that tension here, and I think that's what we're meant to read at the end, where we hear Jacob blessing his sons, that they are included in this covenant community despite their sins and shortcomings. And to me, that's wonderful encouragement for all of us. And so Jacob gives this command that his sons would carry him back to Canaan. And you'll remember this is a very important theme, because already he has made Joseph swear by it in this very unusual ceremony, but this one in which the gravity of the situation was made apparent to Joseph, that what he is swearing to is something that is greater than a very simple promise. Yes, I promise I will take out the trash tomorrow. This was something that was solemn. It would be almost as if cutting a covenant. This was the length at which Jacob went to make sure Joseph knew what he was supposed to do after his death. Again, it's like a last will and testament. It is to be carried out exactly as the deceased said it should. But also, this is what God promised Jacob. He promised him two things. He said, Joseph will close your eyes in death, and that I will bring you back to the land of Canaan. And so we see in this chapter both of those things come to fulfillment. Joseph is there when his father dies, and Joseph and the sons take his body back to Canaan. And so the Lord here, even in this small thing where he comforts Jacob as he leaves to Egypt, he comforts Jacob that even after his death, he will fulfill his promise to him. But that doesn't negate the secondary means, does it? I mean, someone still has to actually carry his body back. And so Jacob sets in motion for his sons to do this and to thus fulfill what God has done. And I think that as you get into the rest of chapter 50, the reason it seems to say the same thing over and over and over again is to just reiterate that not only has God's promise been fulfilled, but the sons have been obedient to what they were supposed to do. And so Jacob dies, but he dies full of years, surrounded by his 12 sons, the one son back from the dead, as it were, a multitude of grandchildren. But he also dies in hope. The writer of Hebrews speaks of it this way in chapter 11. He said, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and have acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." This is clearly Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. And so think about this. Jacob dies outside of the land of promise. Abraham dies, and the only thing he owns is a small burial plot. But Hebrews says, "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." Think of these words. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they knew the promises, but they never fully realized them. Jacob here dies outside of the promised land. And he has to die in hope that God will answer and fulfill and that his sons will be obedient. But he clearly dies in that hope. But ultimately, he is looking forward to something greater, as Abraham had to be. And so Jacob does as well. And so Jacob dies full of years, surrounded by his family, but also dies in faith of something greater. Chapter 50 begins with Joseph mourning. And this is the fulfillment, part one, of what God said, that Joseph would close your eyes in death, meaning that Joseph would be there at the end. And again, this great promise that this son who was thought killed turns out to not only be alive, but also to be the ruler of Egypt, and also will be there at the end of Jacob's life. Again, you think of the blessings that God has bestowed upon Jacob. And so Joseph weeps. And then interestingly, both Jacob and Joseph are embalmed. They're the only two Israelites to be mentioned of being embalmed. And part of this is actually just simply practical. They're going to have to transport a body at a later date. Because for the Egyptians, this is a very religiously significant. They embalm the bodies because they believe that the soul will actually come back and inhabit the exact same body. Whereas for the Israelites, this is simply a way in which they need to functionally transport. It is a purely practical reason. But it's very similar in the sense that they are doing this because there is a hope of resurrection. And that's indeed why they're going back to the land of Canaan. But interestingly, we see at the end of Jacob's life, we see this really grand funeral for him that seems unmatched by really almost anyone else in the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis. That all of the Egyptians mourned for him for a total of 70 days. Likely the embalming took 40 days, and then there were an additional 30 days total for 70 days in which they mourned over Jacob. And again, just speaks to how important Joseph is to the Egyptians. But then we get this very interesting segment here where Jacob's body is transported out. And it's hard to see from just the writing on the text, the journey that they take, because you'll note Egypt is here, and you've got and Israel is here. And trying to get to that cave in Machpelah, you could just go straight up. That's what you should do to make the journey the shortest. But here we have a whole retinue of Egypt, of chariots and horsemen, of elders, of this great company of Egyptians as well as Israelites going. And the route they take is actually they go around and up. And you'll notice it talks about the Jordan up here as there's this threshing floor at Atad. And that they then cross over the Jordan and then into Canaan. And some of you who have really great spatial reasoning are sitting here going, that sounds like a journey someone else took in the Bible. And actually, Jacob is taking the same route that the Israelites would later take in the Exodus. So it does seem that God is specifically using this transport of Jacob as a mini Exodus. You'll note there's even Egyptians and chariots and horsemen. And what do we see? Jacob is brought out of Egypt and brought to his final resting place in the land of promise. What is going to happen to the Israelites? They are going to be brought out and brought into the land of promise. And so you have Atad, which is beyond the Jordan. And here, when it talks about beyond the Jordan, it just simply depends on where you're viewing that from. And most commentators agree that we're looking from the promised land out. And so that Atad is actually on the other side, and that's where they stop. And if you think about it, it seems as if what's happening here is that they stop in Atad before they cross the Jordan. There's this period of mourning that they have, and it's likely here that they leave the Egyptians behind. And so you have the 7 days of mourning, and then they move from there, and then they move to Machpelah, where the children eventually intern their father, probably by themselves. And again, you have this double theme of the obedience of the sons, you have the fulfillment of what God has said, and you also have this mini Exodus here. And so here we just have the culmination of what all that God has said. He has brought Jacob back, and he will ultimately do the same thing for the Israelites later. And you really have here again this theme of a good death, that Jacob has died in faith, God has fulfilled his promises, and he has brought Jacob back to the land of promise. And then interspersed between this, you have this reconciliation. If you remember back to the story, his brothers, Joseph's brothers, had sold him into slavery. He had gone through this 13 years living in exile from his people, and all because his brothers hated him. And so, of course, that now that their father has passed, the brothers now think, well, of course, he will seek vengeance upon us. Of course, he was nice to us simply because Jacob was alive, but Joseph ultimately has been harboring that anger at us over what we did for him. And so they send an emissary to him in order to see what the state of Joseph is. And they send forward and they say, by the way, our father told us that you should forgive us for the transgressions, the sin, and the evil that we did to you. Now please forgive the transgressions of your servants, of the servants of God, of your father. A lot of commentators will say that here they're just fabricating this lie in order to help Joseph seek to forgive him. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. It could very well be that Jacob, as he's dying, knows that Joseph has forgiven his brothers, but knows the brothers are still concerned about it. And so it could very well be that he has told them, here, if this happens, say this to Joseph. Because the Bible will oftentimes just not tell us everything. In fact, we're never told that where Rebekah and Leah are buried until we come to this section here. And so it's entirely possible that Jacob actually did say this to his sons, because this seems to me one of those things that this type of lie is one that could have disastrous consequences should it ever be found out. And so in my mind, I think the brothers are just simply that scared, and they're bringing these words from their father. And for Joseph, when he hears this, he just weeps. He wept as they spoke. He weeps because he has truly forgiven his brothers for the evil that they've done. And he's hurt that they don't see this. And so he says to them, do not fear. He says, for am I in the place of God? That God is ultimately the one who has done all of these things, though you have certainly sinned and done evil against me. Look what God has brought about from this. From all that he's done, Joseph has saved this great multitude of people through this, and it would not have been able to happen had he not been brought through this terrible path that he was brought through. And so here he acknowledges the simple fact that his brothers did evil, and they are guilty. God is not guilty of the evil his brothers did to him. His brothers are guilty. They are the ones who desired to harm him, desired to hurt him, and then put into action selling him as a slave. And so God brought about good out of the evil of these brothers. And Joseph ends, do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And you have this situation now where the brothers are worried about retribution, and Joseph simply turns and says, no, I'm not going to seek vengeance upon you. In fact, I'm going to provide for you and for your families. That what we have here is true and lasting and real reconciliation. I mean, you see that here where the brothers, they acknowledge their actual sins. Look at the way in which the text tells us. We've got the word transgression, we've got the word sin, and we've got the word evil. We've got all these things where the brothers are simply acknowledging that what they did was nearly unforgivable. And yet they seek forgiveness, and Joseph forgives them by simply reminding them that he is not in the place of God, and that God brought great good out of it. And really, again, this theme is certainly the theme of Joseph's story, but it's the theme of the entirety of Genesis and really the entirety of the Bible. We have God creating everything good. We have man who brings sin into this world, but yet God continues to bring good out of the evil of men. And it's one of these great mysteries of how this happens. In many ways, we simply do not have an answer other than God does not cause sin, but uses sinful men for his purpose. Because really, we have no other choice. Because we know sin exists. We know there's evil in this world. And we could just sit and say, well, the world is evil and continuing in evil, and there's no hope and no way of reconciling this. Or we could say, yet we desire goodness. We look and we hope, and we have this idea of paradise, of restoration. We have this idea that there is something beyond our life and beyond our world, that there is a possibility for perfection and for paradise. And really, it's the Bible that says that there's a reason for that. There's a reason you yearn for these things. There's a reason that you see injustice, you see evil, and you see these things and it grieves you and you don't want them to exist. And here we see that tied together in Joseph's story where he says, you did evil, but God did good. And that's the story of our lives, that if you are in Jesus Christ, you have faith in him, there's evil that has been done to you. Frankly, there's evil that you've done. And yet God is using all of that ultimately for his good. Romans 8:28. That all things work together for the good of those who trust in Jesus. And here that's the theme of Genesis, and it's the theme of the rest of the Bible. And so you have these twin themes of reconciliation and sovereignty. And then finally, you have the death and burial of Joseph in verses 22 through 26. So Joseph's life, just like Jacob's, we see at the end here that God has blessed them, has blessed him, for he lived 110 years and he's seen to the next generation. So from his sons, he's seen the children who have come after, all the way to the third generation. And so here he sees his children's children, and he, just like Jacob, he gives this request, he calls the sons of Israel his brothers here, likely meaning not his actual brothers, because Joseph's one of the youngest, but really now the sons of Israel, that here's what they are to do, and they are to pass this along generation by generation by generation, that he is to be taken back to the land of promise. I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of the land, to visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. And speaks of him being embalmed as well and put into a coffin. And here the word coffin, it's kind of anachronistic. What they mean is it's a box. It's like an ossuary box where his bones eventually would be placed in. But the word is the same word used for the ark. I mean, if you think about it, the ark of Noah is a box. The ark of the covenant, well, it's a box. And actually what Moses was placed in was an ark as well. Again, it's a box. And here Joseph is placed in a box. But it does seem interesting that when the Israelites leave, they are carrying the ark of the covenant. They're actually also carrying the ark of Joseph's bones. And so you have here this, like I said, interesting difference between the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. In Jacob's death, he is carted off to Canaan. He's buried there. And if you think about what happens later, that if God does not fulfill his promise to bring the people out, it doesn't really matter to Jacob, does it? Jacob will still remain buried in the land of promise. But Joseph here at the end of his life ties his burial and his future hope to what God will do. He acts as a sign or a testimony of his faith by saying, I will eventually arrive in the land of promise. I will eventually get there because, as God has shown over my life, that what he promises he will bring about. And actually, you fast forward to the end of Exodus, you see that after the Israelites have come out, what do they carry with them? They carry Joseph's body with them. But Joseph here, he dies simply in faith. He dies here saying God will ultimately fulfill his promises. And actually, as Moses is writing this and the people of Israel are suffering, they actually would have the bones of Joseph. They would have this tangible, visible sign that Joseph died, saying, God will bring you out and you will bring me with you. And so I think in many ways the difference between Jacob and Joseph is that Joseph dies as a testimony to his faith in order to really encourage the rest of the Israelites. That he has staked his, I can't say life, but he has staked his burial on the fact that God will fulfill his promise. And so Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a box or in a coffin in Egypt. And it's interesting to note the Hebrew as well as the English, the last words of Genesis are in Egypt. And so as we come to the end of Genesis, I just think for a moment, is this a good ending? Is it a good ending? Because you have this tension between the ways in which they have died, blessed, full of years, surrounded by family, but also you simply have death. So you have blessing on the one hand, you have death on the other. You have God's promises that are hanging out in the open, unfulfilled. And then you're left with this foreboding sense of in Egypt. Not in the land of promise, but in a foreign land. That's where Joseph is interned. That in this time in between, when God will fulfill his promise, he is yet not in the land of promise. And so Genesis ends, I think, in an interesting way. The book of Genesis is itself fascinating because when we come to it, we think of, if I were to ask you, who's the main character of Genesis? We tend to think of Abraham. But really, by chapter length, it's Jacob. Jacob is really the character who predominates the book of Genesis. From chapter 25 to chapter 50, it's really about Jacob. It's interesting. And I think in many ways it shows us that God's ways are not our ways. Because who would think Jacob would be the most important out of the three? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So is it a good ending? Well, in many ways it's a realistic ending for the time being. Right? Death is around. I mean, if you haven't experienced the death of a loved one, the odds are you will. Death is real, it is there, and it is ugly, and it is awful. And there's no getting around it. But yet, on the same way, God is there, and blessings abound. And we can testify to the way in which God has blessed us individually, that he has helped us, he's guided us. But yet, while things can maybe be good or things can be bad, they can be easy, they can be difficult, but it simply points to the fact that they're just not as they should be. We started in perfection and we end up in death and in Egypt. And so Genesis is about beginnings. It's the beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning of creation. It's a book about beginnings, and so I think its ending is meant to be open-ended. There's just more to the story. Right? There's this promised seed of the woman. There's this promised one who would come, who would destroy death and evil. There's the son who would come ultimately from the line of Abraham, who would bring blessing to the nations. There is one who is better than Isaac, who would be a sacrifice in order that sins might be atoned. There's a greater one than Jacob. There's one coming who is better than Joseph, who is going to go face to face with a greater one than Pharaoh. There's this king coming from the line of Judah. And ultimately, there's a desire for a city that's greater than the small burial plot in Canaan. And so there's more to this story. It's all here, but it's not all accomplished. And that's our own lives. There's more to our story. God is at work. God is doing things. God is redeeming and bringing his plan to fulfillment. But it's not there yet. Like the Israelites, we await. We wait in this in-between time. But like Jacob and like Joseph, there's two ways to wait. There's to wait in hope that God will accomplish out of evil good, or there's a way to wait in despair till that time in which you just die and you no longer suffer and you're off this mortal coil and you don't have to worry about anything anymore. And so you view life as a series leading to an end that is a final end, or you look, as Jacob and Joseph, to a death and to an end that's a beginning. The rest of the Bible unfolds the fact that even death isn't the end. That death is merely a means to another greater, glorious, eternal end. And so you have that in the life of Jacob and of Joseph. And so this morning, really the thing to think through and to understand and to take heart in is do you believe in something greater? Is your faith like Jacob and Joseph's? Because as the Bible unfolds, there is this one who comes, who conquers death. Jacob and Joseph had no idea how all of this was going to be resolved. And yet the New Testament tells us Jesus has come as the one who conquers death. And so it's wonderful. It's good news. And as we come later to the Lord's Supper to remember his death, we remember his death and his resurrection. So let us pray.